Thank you very much. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tony Perez, and we've been asked to provide a little bit of background on ourselves. So here's the TLDR version of me. I'm a former U.S. Marine, former co-founder at Security, former general manager at GoDaddy, specifically on the security product group, and I'm currently one of the founders here at CleanBrowsing and Knock. My session today won't have slides, so you'll have to see my face and hear me out, but it's specifically designed to focus on the consumers of the encryption technologies being built by this community, more specifically their effects on this audience. But before I get started, because I know how it can all be, I want to make something explicitly clear. Everything I will be discussing has nothing to do with encryption itself, but everything to do with A, its implementation, forcing and auto configurations, and B, its optionality and lack thereof with little regard to explicit choice. So, to provide a little context, CleanBrowsing is a DNS resolver with special focus on serving what we feel to be an underrepresented audience, children, specifically prepubescent children. I want you to think 13 and under, and by association, their parents. Daniel and I built CleanBrowsing as a way to solve our own problem with our own prepubescent children, whom, like so many, were consumed by their time online. We quickly found them knee-deep in the ugly side of the web, always 2 clicks away from landing on pornographic or obscene content, or otherwise being hit with a site being used for malicious campaigns. Naturally, we solved this problem by turning to DNS to help us control what was happening on our network. In the process of solving our own problem, however, we stumbled into this ecosystem of network admins that don't realize that they themselves are also network admins and have very similar responsibilities. I want you to think of parents. I want you to think of small organizations like libraries, schools, and religious organizations, many of which many of you interact with daily. In fact, if you look at the most modern home networks today, they are all in respect their own small enterprise, often servicing between 20 to 100 different devices at any given time, amplified by the introduction of mobile and IoT-based devices. It's with this in mind that my talk today focuses on those users that don't have a representation or a voice in these types of settings. Not the technical nuances and developments we have in store for the internet, but on those whom we are building these things for. Because if we're building these to protect these consumers from the ISPs and the governments that are hell-bent on snooping their data and using it against them, should we not take their experiences into consideration? I would argue that we should. Unfortunately, we believe that the same broad strokes applied to DNS in its infancy are also being applied in our new efforts to encrypt it. We are all assuming all users are the same and the security and privacy applies to all equally. We believe this to be incorrect when it comes to our youth. Recent numbers show that there are about 2.2 billion children between the ages of 0 and 14 living in the world. There are 7.8 billion people in the world. That means that close to a third of the world's population are children, not including their parents, guardians, and organizations charged with protecting them. In a recent study, researchers found that by age 7, 53% of the children own a device and were online. That number dramatically increased to 90% by the age of 11. It's only safe to assume that with time, that introductory age will drop, the same as it has in our own lifetime. And the question still remains, what are we as technologists doing about it? The harsh reality is nothing. We are, however, building these great technologies like encryption, with very little consideration for about a third of our population. When we speak about the need for encryption, we brush over it with the threats of governments and ISPs going through our data and selling it for marketing. And yet we don't talk about the threats the same web introduces to us as individuals or our own children. While many might not believe this to be a real threat, I can assure you that for parents, this is a very real concern. And it is a threat that many are investing dearly to solving for their own families. So how is encrypted DNS part of all this? Well, we force encrypted DNS at the browsers, making the browsers exceptionally difficult to manage, create open ecosystems, then send parents on their merry way, all in the name of security and privacy. And yet, we offer little in the form of true management. At the device level, we introduce these new technologies in the name of security and privacy as well, but allow apps to forego alt network configurations and controls, allowing them to route the user's information to their own silos. Are we not concerned about these silos? Our current approach implies that only bad actors are ISPs and governments, and we must do everything in our power to ensure they don't get the data. But if recent history has taught us anything the past 5 years, it is the private organizations that are just as susceptible to misusing data and breaking our trust, and encryption is not solving that. I personally believe that at the core of this conversation, there is an ideological one of, are all the users the same? And for us, as parents, we would argue that no, they are not, especially when they are under 13. It is our responsibility to mold them and our choice on what they can and can't see. Currently, however, the industry's approach to encryption implementation is taking that choice away. What we are doing is telling parents, we know better, trust us. But we don't. The current implementation of encryption technology is one that assumes all users are alike, and it's leaving children exposed, breaking the trust with parents, and leaving them infuriated and frustrated. For example, let's take a look at Apple and how they handle VPNs. Almost all parental control applications leverage some form of VPN to intercept outgoing communication and tunnel that back to their respective network for applying whatever rules were defined by the parent. On the flip side, children, even as young as 2 years old, are able to leverage the VPNs to forego the network's controls at home and at schools. It is widely advertised and discussed across forums and online channels. Did you know that settings itself is not available in the screen time and parental control features, let alone the VPN configuration? That the only way to truly disable VPN settings on iOS devices is to place the device in supervised mode? So we can make it extremely easy for a user, any age user, to configure a VPN, but if parents want to enforce it, they can't. Even with the enforced VPN always on function, a user has 2 to 3 different ways to disable that. Okay, but that's VPN, Tony. No problem. Let's look at what Apple is doing with applications and encryption. In August of 2020, Apple announced the option for encrypted DNS for application developers. They kick it off with a simple statement. When people access the web within your app, their privacy is paramount. Safeguard that information by leveraging encrypted DNS across our platform to deliver private and secure connectivity within your app. Cool, makes perfect sense. But for as much as Apple is concerned about the people's desire to safeguard their information, they completely ignore the people's intent and choice. Let's say, for instance, that person has a networking rule that has already encrypted their communication to their preferred provider. Too bad, doesn't matter, use the apps, which you don't even know what they are using, if they are using it, or who they are using. Let's then assume that the user wants to explicitly use their own encrypted DNS. There's literally no way for the average user to do this, and the apps forego it regardless. So, app developers are doing this exactly. They are building their own encrypted tunnels that completely circumvent the systems and network settings deployed by organizations, and there are few options to address this. It's okay though, because we know better. Perhaps the biggest user and earliest adopter of this is TikTok. For months now, they have been the biggest problems for schools and parents who wish to stop its communication, but have been unsuccessful because of how we are rolling out encryption. And while some of these things might sound benign to some engineers, the implications are very real to a parent. Everything from social media and pornography addiction to sourcing and researching harmful content like self-harm, terrorism, mass shootings, cyberbullying, child sexuality and abuse material, the list goes on. And as parents, again, we're being left with little to no options, all while amplifying the need for security and privacy and exclaiming the importance of safeguarding people's data. But it doesn't stop there. Let's take some time to look at the browsers. All major browsers have introduced a secure DNS option, which, when you think about it, is actually pretty impressive that they were able to come to consensus on the name. This option, however, is 2 clicks away in Firefox, Edge, Brave, and Chrome, and not one offers a global disable feature. They by default assume every user of the browser is an adult that deserves security and privacy at all times. Not all implementations are the same, however. Some appear to be more effective than others, but almost all stop short of providing a comprehensive approach. For instance, Chrome and Chromium-based browsers are actually very respectful of the system settings, only forcing encrypted DNS if they identify the system to already be configured to use a DNS resolver that has a corresponding encryption option. This is superb. If the user doesn't have a resolver that offers encrypted DNS, they don't enforce it. This is how it should be, where the user has choice. Thank you for doing this. But then we have Firefox. In their world, the right approach to encrypting DNS is to force on all users, completely ignoring what the user might have configured. To be fair, they do offer an option for services to provide a network signal that will stop the forced enablement. But in both Chromium-based browsers and Firefox, the user always allowed to navigate to the privacy and security general network settings by default and quickly enable the option as they please or disable it as they please, regardless of the network's preference, regardless of age. So on one hand, the browsers recognize that a choice is being made, but for whatever reason, actively choose to ignore that choice by introducing the option to override it anyway. Even with Firefox, that is literally checking for a signal for the network that states controls are actively in place, the browser is pushing the option to override the network's decision. Why? This is made worse by the labyrinth that exists if a user wants to disable the feature outright in their respective devices. Coincidentally, the secure DNS option is quickly becoming the #1 mechanism ahead of VPNs used by children to bypass controls in their homes and schools alike. If this was an unknown problem, this might be acceptable, but it's not. It is by design. and it's a very well-known problem, but one that the community we seem to be okay with. Well, sort of. You see, we are cognizant of the problem. In fact, we have introduced options to disable secure DNS on machines, but mostly focus on enterprise users. For a parent, that task becomes exhaustive and is, in some instances, unattainable. But I'm here to say it does matter. This is especially true for parents and their children. And it's further complicated because not every parent is as technically literate as those of us willing to spend our Saturday thinking and talking about encryption. We're building technologies like encryption, building it to help against the ISP and government overlords, ignoring the corporate overlords and the very user's choice whom we're building it for. So what can we do? I believe there are three very specific things we should consider moving forward as a community. One, we need to recognize choice. It's true that most consumers are technically illiterate when it comes to what we're discussing, but there is a growing segment that isn't. This segment is working hard to take control of their environment, and we believe we have a responsibility to acknowledge that choice. A great example of how to do this is to leverage something as simple as Google Safe Search. Similar to what Firefox is already doing for network signaling, when a browser initiates, they should be able to do a lookup to see if Safe Search is enabled. If it is fair to assume that network is doing something to enforce that configuration. It's literally only enabled by network manipulation. We cannot think of a legitimate reason why that choice cannot be respected. It's almost always deployed by an individual organization that is trying to employ a safe browsing experience on their network. But not only should we recognize and respect that choice, we should also consider disabling secure DNS option when signal is provided. If we're going to go as far as recognizing a signal not to change or force encrypted DNS, then we should acknowledge that the same signal implies disable the future, or give the network the ability to push the preferred encrypted DNS option as defined by the network, but remove the user's ability to manipulate it. Two, better information dissemination on disabling features. We cannot assume that enterprises are the only environments that have filtering in place or that want to control their internet experiences. Creating safe browsing experiences extend far beyond the enterprise and easily touch families around the world. We need to expand our documentation to include instructions for those environments that don't have enterprise features, things like MDMs. We also need to make more time to think about our devices and introduce use cases that account for a parent's choice. And three, we need to integrate and respect parental controls. Currently, Firefox will recognize if parental controls are enabled on Windows if using Windows option, but there is little information on how that works. If you try to enable it on Microsoft, it's a labyrinth of information with little clarity on how it works at the system level. It's a black box experience that few parents can enable. It also doesn't take into consideration parents that leverage parental control features for things like time scheduling and system access, but then integrate third-party integrations for filtering. At the mobile device level, we have to seriously think more actively on what those features should and should not truly control. Settings on both Apple and Android are rich with features and should be protected and kept from curious minds. Additionally, there needs to be a deeper conversation of the implications of assuming and treating every user the same. No one is against the idea of introducing encryption at the application level within mobile devices, but there should be a choice at the device level to accept or deny that action by the application. With that in mind, I leave you with these final thoughts. If encryption was built to help the consumer's data keep the consumer's data safe, then the consumer should make the choice when it should be used and should be using it. We can't build for an audience that has no voice, and we should be more considerate of our children and our parents' choice. They make up more than a third of our population. In the end, we don't have to do any of this, but my biggest concern is that not doing so will be counterproductive to what we're truly trying to accomplish with security and privacy, and it will lead to encryption being disabled by users and service providers. With that, I thank you for your time.
Well, that was amazing, Tony. So we had a lot of discussions about your talk and a bunch of questions as well. So feel free to take a look at what we have sure. And answer whatever you want.
I'll look at the cherry pick questions now. So I think the first question, the first question is an interesting one. I have a new daughter, 6 weeks old. She's now not using the internet yet, but when she's grown as a teen and as an adult, I want to have the privacy which she will need to have agencies in the world of year 2040. Is it proportionate to require drilling holes in DNS integrity now, ostensibly, to protect her as a teen when it will clearly do greater extent impact her as an adult? No. And in fact, I'm not saying to drill holes in the integrity of DNS. What I am saying, though, is for our implementation. In fact, nothing that I'm talking about is about affecting how encrypted DNS works, but everything about how platforms are integrating and forcing encryption on users. I do believe that we should have a choice as a parent between those early years of 6 weeks old and 11 years old or 13 years old, or whatever you as a parent choose, right? Whatever your religious beliefs are, your personal beliefs. And I think something you'll find is as they get older, you'll be surprised at the content that they find online. And you might find that you really don't like them having that access. And there'll be nothing more infuriating than the technologies that you've built being used against you and the controls you put in place in your own home. So do you believe we should have secure DNS with control, or do you suggest should not have secure DNS? I actually believe that we should absolutely have secure DNS. I'm a huge proponent for encrypted DNS. We support it at CleanBrowsing. We have for a long time. We try to, all our apps actually leverage encrypted DNS. And we talk about secure DNS. We do believe that up to about 11, 13 years old, we should be respecting the parent's choice and their decisions, right? If a parent is actively not taking any precautions in their environment, they're not going to know the difference. But if a parent is proactively deploying something in their environment, especially at the network level, right? I mean, this isn't a basic subject. We should be respectful of that. We should understand that that parent is intuitive enough to what's happening on the web. They're deploying something, and we should treat it the same way we would treat it in an enterprise.